Hello BookTube, and welcome to another weekly reading vlog. So this week I actually have a book haul to report on. Now, book haul, if you're not familiar, actually I suspect everyone's familiar, right? Because the only people watching this video are BookTube people, right? I'm going to explain anyways, just to be on the safe side. Book haul is a BookTube tradition where you buy a bunch of books and then make a video showing all the books that you have just bought. If you watch any amount of BookTube channels, you'll see this a lot. I've never done this before. This is my first time doing this on this channel. I haven't done it before for a number of reasons. The primary reason is I tend not to buy a bunch of books at once. Because I'm a slow reader, one, so if I buy a huge stack of books, there's a good chance I'm not going to get through it, and then it's just going to clutter up my apartment. As well, living abroad, I've got a rather transient lifestyle. I move frequently, so I don't want to load up on more books than I can get through in a reasonable amount of time. And also, I've got a bad habit of buying more books than I need, or historically, I have had this habit. So one of the things I've tried really hard to discipline myself with over the years is not to buy too many books. The other reason I haven't been doing book hauls on YouTube is because I've started doing what I call started videos, which is making a video when I start a new book. And I figure that takes the place of doing a book haul. Like, rather than making an announcement when I've bought a bunch of books, I just wait till I have time to start a specific book and then make a video then. But all that being said, I did actually... How many books did I buy this week? 4 books plus 1 box set. So, I don't know, either 5 books, or if you count the books in the box set separately, maybe 8 books. And I feel like that's a book haul of sorts, something to remark on. So the reason I did it was, well, it was basically poor impulse control. I probably shouldn't have bought this many books at once, given how long it takes me to get through a book, and given how many books unread books I've got on my shelves at the moment. But we're just coming out of a long COVID lockdown here in Vietnam. And I was in the city center going to the dentist yesterday. And after I got out of the dentist, I thought, it's been so long since I browsed the bookstores. And there's a whole bunch of titles I was interested in. I didn't find the titles I was looking for, actually. That's life, isn't it? And it's especially life in Asia, where there are plenty of English books, but you can never go to the bookstore looking for something specific. You just have to go to the bookstore and see what you find. So I went to one of the major bookstores in Saigon. I also went to a place they call Book Street, which is in one of the tourist areas, which is basically what it sounds like. It's a whole bunch of book set up on what used to be an alleyway near one of some of the famous tourist attractions. And I thought I'd report on that. So the first thing is where is it? The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings box set, which I talked about yesterday in a started video. The other books, and I'm not going to talk long about any of these, because on this channel, when I start a book, I make a started video. And so I'll talk about all the reasons I bought the books, and what my history is with these books, and why I wanted to read these books in those videos, if and when I ever get around to actually reading these things. I've got enough on my plate at the moment. But I will go through these really briefly. So, Bambi by Felix Satin. I actually read this as a kid. I think I was about 11 years old, maybe 5th or 6th grade. Uh, I don't remember it. Well, I'm overdue for a reread, and something I've been doing a lot this year, and something I think I'm going to continue to do, is start rereading stuff. So all those classics I read when I was in my school days, reread them and talk about them on this channel. There are a few things that stick out in my mind about this book, mostly it being really dark in places, although I don't remember the specifics. But it's interesting just looking at the cover here. It says, powerful and unapologetic, a celebration of the forest that Sultan loves so dearly. The forest may be dangerous, but even in its wintry worst, even with hunters and foxes and magpies and crows, it is not dreadful, but beautiful. So that's a quote from Tor.com. I know you have to take those back cover quotes with a grain of salt, but perhaps I'm misremembering this book. Perhaps I'm just remembering the dark parts of it, and would do well to reread it and just get the flavor of it again. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention this earlier, but apologies as always for everything in mirror image on this camera. Then, The Never-Ending Story, translated, I believe, from the German. This is, of course, the movie The Never-Ending Story was big when I was a kid in the 1980s. I don't have quite the attachment to the movie that some people from my generation have. But when I saw the book, I was kind of curious to read what the story behind the movie was, and it looks like it's kind of a fun fantasy book, so we'll put this on the to be read pile. And then Gone with the Wind. Now, Gone with the Wind is one of those books that I've been thinking for ages, should I read it, should I not read it? But I've decided I should read it. And I've decided partly this from the influence of BookTube, which has encouraged me to try to be more diverse in my reading. For most of my life, I've not thought of myself as so much as a reader generally, but somebody who has very specific tastes, and somebody who goes after books that meet that narrow criteria. But after being more immersed in BookTube and seeing how many people on BookTube just read a great diversity of stuff, I wanted to try and be more diverse in my tastes. Even though romance novels was never really my thing, and even though I've always viewed this book with suspicion, because, as a northerner, my sympathies are all with the North. And then, of course, this book does have a reputation for glossing over the horrors of slavery. But I need to read it and decide for myself. I've decided I can't go off other people's opinion of this book. And I've heard enough good things about this book that makes me curious about it. And then the Life of Frederick Douglass, his autobiography. A very slim little volume here, but again, something I've heard good things about here on BookTube, I believe. I think Steve Donahue was mentioning it on his channel. And just flipping through it in the bookstore. I mean, the thing was published. When was this thing published? In the 1840s or something. But just flipping through it in the bookstore, you could turn to any page and it was obvious that it was quite readable. And Frederick Douglass is one of those historical figures that I've been thinking in the back of my mind I should read up on him more and then never do. So yes, that's the book haul. I'll talk more about these books as I get into them, when I get into them. But so much for the book haul. Let's talk about what I read this week. So actually, transitioning off from the book haul, I can talk about The Hobbit, which I started yesterday after buying this, and 54 pages read yesterday afternoon. That's good for me. Although these aren't demanding pages, large print, relatively small book. It's not like reading Don Quixote or anything like that. I made a started video with this box set yesterday, in which I rambled on for a long time, talking about my whole history with this series, and largely it was an apology for not having read it completely up until this point. I mentioned in that video that I did read The Hobbit from cover to cover at the end of college, and found it was a bit of a slog because I already knew the story from the Rankin Bass movie, and found that just reading all the details in the book I felt a lot of unnecessary, boring details without adding anything to the enjoyment of the story. That's what I said yesterday. However, having spent some of the yesterday afternoon reading the first few chapters, I'm finding it very delightful. Maybe because my expectations are different now. I'm not expecting it to move quickly. I think I've also learned now that these Tolkien books are more about atmosphere than the plot. So just kind of getting in the atmosphere of this mystical world. But yeah, finding it very pleasant reading. In spite of what I said yesterday. So, even though I had memories of The Hobbit being a bit of a slog, I'm finding this very pleasant. I already know the story, of course. I think by this point, everybody already knows the story from Hollywood. But finding the actual reading of it quite enjoyable. Then, from the Complete Stories of Oz, I finished off this week The Marvelous Land of Oz. Doing this as a buddy read with Dane Reads. We're trying to work through the series together. And we're going to be posting our reviews tomorrow. So I'll save my thoughts on this for tomorrow when I post the review. But yes, finished off The Marvelous Land of Oz this week. Also finished off Alice. Sorry. I finished off Through the Looking Glass. I was going to say Alice Through the Looking Glass, but the title is actually Through the Looking Glass. The second book in the Alice in Wonderland story. And reviewed it in a video made earlier this week, and don't really have anything more to say about it. Everything I wanted to say was in my review. So that's both of the stories in this little volume done now. So this one's off the shelf. This one's done with. Continuing to make very slow progress on the grammar book. Only read a handful of pages this week. How many pages did I read? 6. So from 208 to 208 to 214. So this is talking about questions in English. And again, apologies for my camera inverting everything, but you can see some sentence trees going on here to show how questions are formed in English. Actually, chapter 11 is just on yes-no questions, which is talking about, in these sentence trees over here, talking about how the operator is moved to the front of the sentence to create a yes-no question. And in these sentences over here, talking about how sentences with no operator invent a do or does or did operator to move to the front of the sentence. As always, I'm finding this book very interesting. They get into some of the interesting little tidbits, because you you start a chapter like this on yes/no questions, and especially for me, somebody who's been teaching English for years, you think, okay, I know how yes/no questions are formed. What could this chapter possibly tell me that I don't know? But they get into a lot of interesting little things about how sometimes, yeah. So with phrasal modals, they often move the first element of the phrasal modal to make the yes/no questions. But there are a few phrasal modals like used to and have to that actually use operators. So we would say, did he used to go skiing when you lived in Vietnam? Lived in Vermont. Lived in Vermont is a sentence in this book. So you create the operator did, even though it's a phrasal modal. Have to as well. But then with B2, so for example, you are to report tomorrow. In that case, just the first element acts as the operator. Are you to report tomorrow? So those kind of things, talking about negative yes/no questions, like don't you have bananas, and what the difference is between them. Something they mentioned here, which reminded me of my experiences learning Japanese. They say negative yes/no questions create semantic problems for many ESL, EFL learners. For example, native speakers of most Asian and West African languages react to a negative yes/no question in a literal manner in their own language. They agree or disagree with its form. So, don't you have bananas would be either yes. If someone says, don't you have bananas? And they say yes, the yes means we have no bananas, because you're agreeing with the negative proposition of that sentence. But actually, in English, if you say, don't you have bananas, you would say yes to mean we do have bananas, and no to meaning we don't have bananas. I remember this from way back, I think my first year in Japan. First or second year in Japan, taking Japanese classes and negative questions in Japanese. And we were discussing how to answer them. And I remember the teacher saying, this is a difference between English and Japanese. In English, you say yes or no based on the semantic content. But in Japanese, you've got to match it to the grammar. So a negative question in Japanese, you would answer in the affirmative to affirm the negativeness of the sentence. So if I'd say, aren't you going out? I would say yes to indicate that I'm not going out in Japanese. Where I would say no to mean, no, you're wrong, I am going out. But then in English, it would be the opposite. And they mention in here that this is something that will trick up EFL, ESL learners because it's not the same in all languages. And yeah, sure enough, this is something I've learned in my experience teaching. So, yeah, I'm not going to go through everything in those 6 pages I read this week. But there's a lot of stuff like that, where getting into the more interesting technicalities or tricky parts of yes/no questions can continue to make this book, I think, worth my while. Of course, the question I always ask myself is, how much of this book am I going to remember when I'm finished? I mean, I would love to just be a walking encyclopedia on grammar and just impress all my colleagues in the staff room by answering all the grammar questions. But I read it, I think to myself, oh, that's interesting, and then I don't remember it a couple weeks later. Okay, and then Herodotus. So I read from page 244 to page 278 in Herodotus. So in this Tom Holland translation, that's finishing up book 3 and into book 4. And there's a lot to talk about. So Herodotus is famous for just having this wandering narrative that goes off on so many different digressions, which makes it really hard to try and summarize the content of what you read for this week. There's an island off the coast of, I guess, what is now Turkey called Samos, which is a Greek island. And there was a Persian guy who conquered it, but then he got himself, he entrenched himself over there and started ignoring orders from King Darius. So King Darius has to get rid of him. And then turns out the brother of the old king is a friend of Darius. He once gave Darius a cloak back when they were back in Egypt, and Darius was not an important person at that time. So in gratitude, Darius tries to get him appointed king of the island, and everything's going good until the old ruler of the island tries to... They had a treaty where he was supposed to evacuate, but he ended up causing trouble and then caused a massacre on the island. There's also a Greek doctor, I think this is pronounced Democedes, who is really good, and Darius has injured his ankle. So Darius has the Greek doctor brought to him. Somebody had told him that he was really good. But the doctor knows that if he reveals his skill, then Darius is just going to keep him as his doctor forever, and he'll never be able to get home. So he tries to disguise the fact that he knows how to heal Darius. But eventually, he is... Yeah, actually, how beginning to forget the details now. How did Darius trick him into revealing his skill? Or force him into revealing his skill? Yeah. Somehow he revealed his skill. Yeah. Oh yeah. He threatened to imprison him, and whip him with whips and cattle goads. So he revealed his skill that way. And then Darius's wife had a growth on her chest that on her breasts that she was too embarrassed to show anyone else. But eventually, when it got big enough that it was a concern, she revealed it to the Greek doctor, and he cured her. But then in exchange, he wanted her to persuade Darius to send out an expedition to the Greeks to see if they could conquer the Greeks. And his plan was he would lead this expedition, and then he would escape and go back to his homeland, which is, after a few wrong turns, eventually what he did. But then the Persians see him again when he's walking on his homeland and try and drag him back. But yeah, he ends up staying in his homeland. And then it talks about how Babylon revolted. Now, Babylon had been captured by the Persians in some of the previous chapters, conquered by the Persians. But now they're revolting, and they're inside their city walls, and Darius and his army are trying to besiege them, but they can't get through the Babylonian walls. So one of Darius's friends, this is one of the seven, they call him one of the seven, because there were seven nobles who were overthrowing the Magians, who were impersonating as the royal family. And that's how Darius became king himself. One of them mutilated himself, cut off his nose and maybe his ears or something. And and then presented himself before Darius. And Darius says, who dared do this to you? And he said, I did it to myself because I knew that if I would ask for your permission, you wouldn't let me do it. But he says, now that I'm mutilated and disfigured and been whipped, I'm going to go to the Babylonians and tell them that I'm deserting to them because you did this to me. And then I'm going to gain their trust, and I'm going to hand the city over to you, which is what he ends up doing. It's a much longer story than I'm making it sound out to be. He has all these steps where he's going to gain the Babylonians' trust by first defeating the Persian armies like 3 times, but then finally, once he's got their trust, opening up the city to Darius. And then book 4 is talking about Darius's campaign against the Scythians. But then it goes, like Herodotus is famous for all these digressions. It goes on this digression talking about the land of the Scythians and all the people who lived beyond the land of the Scythians, which I guess was mostly lands that the Greeks did not know well. So it was lands of legend or hearsay to them. There's a map here, and again, apologies for this showing up in reverse order and mirror image, but this is the world according to Herodotus. And it's interesting, some of these people, the further north you get, the more fantastical it gets. He talks about a people called the Cimmerians, which I guess used to inhabit the land of the Scythians before the Scythians conquered it. He talks about what happened to the Cimmerians. He's got 2 separate stories about what might have happened to the Cimmerians, which is typical of Herodotus. He will often have like 2 or 3 stories. And he'll say, well, you know, these are the stories I've got. Somebody told me this story. Somebody told me this story. I'll give them both, and you can make up your mind which is more believable to you. But yeah, it was interesting because I was reading that. I was thinking, where have I heard that name before? Cimmerians. And I thought maybe it was from those Conan the Barbarian stories. And I Googled it, and sure enough, it was. What was the name of the guy? Robert E. Howard? Was he the guy who wrote the Conan stories? So he was, the Cimmerians in his stories don't seem to be the same ones as in Herodotus, but the Conan the Barbarian stories were set like so far in the past that maybe. I didn't get a definitive answer on this. But then there's also a people, the Hyperborean, which are a people so far up in the snowy north that they're pretty mythical, and Herodotus has all these crazy stories about them. So I Googled those as well, and sure enough, these are, I guess, mythological peoples that show up in Herodotus as you know, Herodotus includes a lot of folktale and mythology in his histories, but you know, because I was thinking, I know I've heard that name before in connection with fantasy literature or something like that. So then I go down this rabbit hole investigating who are the Hyperboreans and what fantasy books have they been in and stuff like that. So, you know, when you're reading a book like this, especially if you have access to the internet, it's quite easy to go down various rabbit holes based on the different things Herodotus says. But it's also interesting. I mean, it's interesting to think about the Cimmerians or the Hyperboreans and to just, you know, imagine these mythical lands. I think that's another reason I'm making such slow progress on this, is because I tend to read a page and then I'll just get lost in thought, and I'll either just be gazing out, or I'll be doing that thing where you think you're still reading, your eyes are still looking at the words, but you've been thinking about something else for a while. Yeah, plenty of interesting digressions in Herodotus where you can easily do that. I'm really glad I'm reading Herodotus. I should have read it years ago. But I do have to say, I do find it a little hard to immerse myself in it the way you would immerse yourself in a more modern book. For example, The Hobbit. Was reading this yesterday as well and found this was a much more immersive experience, whereas this was something I did in fits and starts, and you're constantly having to go back to the map to say, okay, where is this place again? The maps are in the back in this book. So really interesting, somewhat slow going, I guess is how I would rate my progress on Herodotus. Okay, I've been rambling on for 30 minutes, so I'm going to stop the video here.